Hello. In the Camden Town murder trial at the turn of the century, a man was asked what he was doing on the street at 2:30 in the morning. And he drew himself up with pride and said to the judge, "My lord, I am a roach fisher." And he was immediately accepted as a respectable man. I believe, in fact, that he was a lavatory attendant, and that every now and then he liked a bit of fresh air, and that he was setting out to be on the River Lee by dawn on a Sunday, when no doubt he would have been fishing with the famous London roach pole, one of the first rods that I ever heard of. In fact, the rods I've heard of in the course of my life will tell you in parable the history of civilization. I can go back even further perhaps in my lifetime, because this is my uncle's fly rod, glad to say kept in perfect condition. It was made entirely of a wood called greenheart, which is one of the heaviest woods in the world, and these separate pieces were experimentally planed down by a man with a circular plane, testing the action until it was perfect, or as perfect as you could make it. Ferrules were made by hand, and it's interesting they didn't trust them completely, because if you look at those two little brass hooks on there, had a reel of silk in their pocket, and they used to put it round their cleat fashion in order to make sure they didn't cast the rod apart when they were fly fishing. As I say, the whole thing handmade, the leather handle put on by a saddler, the brass fittings by a metal worker, and in particular the silver mounting on the top of the handle. Mark that, because this rod, in fact, when it was made, cost 36 shillings. And I keep it in that condition in memory of my uncle, who taught me how to fish. But at the same time, they were making in London the London roach pole, which I'm sure the lavatory attendant would have been fishing with, because all the roach fishing on the River Lee did. And this one was made, and probably his was made, by a gentleman called Mr. Sowerbutts, who had a shop right next door to the fish market in London. And the way he made it was that he took a very stiff material called Spanish reed. This rod had to be very stiff. And he had things called spade bits, which were like a flattened, sharpened teaspoon on the end of a long rod of steel, and he put them through like that, twisted them as they went. I watched him do this in his 90s, and when he put a larger one in and so on, and gradually he'd take out all the interior of that Spanish reed except this hard skin on the outside, and thus he would make a rod which would go together and extend very completely stiffly but very light in weight for about 20 feet, which is what these rods had to do. Because there was no reel on them, you see, so all you could have was a length of line on the end. And when you actually had to land a fish, when the whole of this was together, resting on your knee, the only way you could land it was to pull the pieces off and throw them beside you, which they did rapidly, like this, when they wanted to land a fish. So that was the London roach pole, a style belonging to particularly to the River Lee and the Thames and the capital city. Because in those days there were different styles of rods all over the country. It's not like nowadays. You go to any fishing tackle shop in England and you will see the same things for everyday modern reasons. Those days in different places you found different rods, and this one, which belongs to a friend of mine, is probably as old as the London roach pole, or even more, is again made of greenheart. But probably a trolling rod. It's probably used by an early pike fisherman, this. But by now, it's got rings on it which will take the line, and it has developed a reel. Not a very good reel, brass reel, it doesn't spin very well, and it's low down on the rod, you see, behind your hand, so you couldn't in any case have used it for controlling the line in a modern way, but it did store line. Here's another rod of the same type, a greenheart rod, except it's not all greenheart. They had begun to experiment is using different rods, different woods on the rod at different points in order to vary the action. So those top three joints are greenheart, but this bottom one is lance wood. That's the same wood, West Indian wood, that the lances handles were made from. And so that was an attempt to stiffen the bottom and leave flexibility at the top and develop some sort of practical action in the fishing rod. Once again, the reel is set very low down, and so we haven't got to the point of modern fishing. But the process went on, and by the middle 30s, when I was a young man fishing, this had been achieved, and I would have said in those days that it was as fine a fishing rod as ever was going to be made. See, the tip is made of split cane, immensely flexible. At this point it starts to stiffen up with the use of a material called tonkin cane. And then it stiffens up a bit further because the tonkin cane has been spliced into a piece of Japanese female cane. And then at the bottom, to give it real stiffness at the butt, we have Spanish reed again. Every one of those pieces was spliced together by hand. Once again, the whole rod was made by hand. It was still entirely a craftsman's performance. And also, a reel had come into fishing, which suited it. Not a lot of room in here for these things. But if you look at this, you see, that's a very different matter altogether from the other reel. And this came from Nottingham, where I think the spinners in the Nottingham laceworks, copying perhaps something in the machinery, produced a reel in which that little centre pin there was the only thing in contact with the spool, so that it spun on that little centre pin. And that, you see, is now fitted high enough on the rod for you to use it to control the line. And this, I thought, and the rest of us did in those days, was the ultimate in fishing, except that about that time a gentleman called Mr. F.W.K. Wallace arrived from the River Trent, bringing with him the Trent style, which was unknown in the south of England, which was a shorter, much more flexible rod, both two top pieces made of split cane, having great flexibility, stiffened up at the bottom with tonkin cane, very beautifully fitted, and by this time the centre pin reel, originating in Nottingham, was now being manufactured, again I'm sure by hand on small lathes, to produce a reel which we thought was the ultimate, which was called the aerial. And that's about where fishing tackle had got to by the time the war came. When we came back from the war, there were no fishing rods. There was nothing, actually. You couldn't hardly buy a nut and bolt in Great Britain, because the whole of the industry had been devoted to the war for a very long time. And it was very hard for anybody to get a fishing rod, particularly boys who were starting fishing, except that there were in the country at that time thousands and thousands and thousands of tank aerials left over as war surplus. They were like the present buggy whip aerial on a car aerial. They were about 3 times as long, very flexible indeed. And for about 6 or 7 years after the war, almost all the people in England who couldn't afford very expensive stuff were fishing with tank aerials. And that encouraged somebody to believe that you might make metal rods. And this one was made about that time of aluminium tube. And it was surprisingly light, it had a very good action, and it looked just for a little while as if metal might be the future material for making rods. Except that something else was on its way. The week I came back from the army, I went into Ogden Smith's shop in St James Street, famous old fishing tackle shop, and they showed me the first fiberglass rod that they'd made. That was made by winding glass fibre around a metal mandrel and painting it with resin, allowing it to harden, and it produced a rod of extraordinary lightness and very good action, and it left really all wooden rods behind. And for 20 years at least after the war, 25 years after the war, people of England were fishing with fiberglass rods, and they believed, of course, that once again fishing had come to its perfection. By now, the famous fixed spool reel had been developed. The reel that casts the line off the end of the spool, like you can pull cotton off a cotton reel, and the spool doesn't have to revolve. And that made the whole thing very much easier. So once again, we'd reached the ultimate, except that there was another material, developed by the Japanese, I think, licensed to only 2 or 3 companies in the world, one in Germany, I think, and Union Carbide in America. This is carbon fibre. It was used for, among other things, the development of aero engine rotors. But look at that. That material is stronger than steel according to its dimensions, and it weighs almost nothing. And that top there, believe it or not, will land heavier fish than most of those hefty rods I've already shown you. This one is actually not yet on the market. It was lent to me by the designer, and it's just going into production. And you realise that nowadays it's become an entirely a factory business, because a lot of money has to go behind somebody if he's going to design one of these rods and put it into factory production. And the same thing has happened to the reels. They've become like something out of a spaceship. Once again, they're manufactured for the world in factories, that one in Japan. And so we are again at the ultimate in fishing tackle. It is difficult to believe that there could be a fishing rod more perfect than this. It's made instead with 3 separate tops with different actions for different ways of fishing, except that the man who designed it and lent it to me told me it'll soon be on the way out, because there's now a new material called boron fibre. So while all this has been happening to rods, what has been happening to fishing? The main thing that happened to angling in the years of my manhood was that anglers started to move about. I can remember Dr. Joad on the Brains Trust in the mid-30s saying that man was going to regret no thing in his development more than the invention of the internal combustion engine. And the fact of the matter is that there are now, I don't know how many anglers, it's put perhaps a little ambitiously at 3.5 million. And of course the majority of them come from the cities, because in any case 7 out of the 10 people in Great Britain now live in cities of more than 500,000 inhabitants, and they began to be able to move. And the Birmingham anglers came down to fish the Hampshire Avon, and they took their motor coaches right across into Lincolnshire every Saturday and Sunday, and gradually all the anglers in England had access to all the waters in England. And the waters became more and more crowded. I can remember going to see the Thames Championship one year. I took my boat up on a trailer and put it in the water at Wallingford, where there were 2 car parks full of vehicles that had brought them, and I drifted downstream for 18 miles. And for 18 miles there were anglers 15 yards apart on both banks. And that brought out to me the other great change, which is the difference in the amount of money that anglers had. People nowadays tend to think of themselves as not very well off. But on that day I went ashore and I asked one of the anglers if I could go through his tackle, and then another, and then another. And counting everything, his umbrella, his boots and everything else, I came to the conclusion, and this was 20 years ago, that every angler there had a getting on for £200 worth of equipment. And when I was young, we used to save up for a year for a second-hand 30-second reel. And so it all became very crowded. And the clubs started to grab water from one another in order to hold fishing for themselves, and more fishing had to be brought into existence. And this very lake, which looks so peaceful, is typical of the extraordinary contradictions of the argument that go on about the countryside and angling nowadays. This is a gravel pit. It's not very old gravel pit, in fact. Next door to it is a very much older one, which we used to fish before this one. And when they began to dig this one, then of course all the protests started. Every time somebody starts to dig gravel in England, there's a protest which tries to stop them. I think, have you got a fish? That's Dave Swallow, one of my best angler friends, who doesn't seem to be doing very well. I've anchored up close to him, thinking it's not a bad place to be if he's chosen it, but he doesn't seem to be doing any good. Anyway, as I say, there were great protests because somebody was going to dig the gravel pit. And yet, in fact, this gravel pit has provided more splendid lake fishing for more anglers than any water I know. And recently the owner of it, the late owner of it, decided he might fill it up in order to make space when he got on and dug a new one. And by then, of course, there was an enormous protest from all the bird lovers who said that it would be an outrage if the gravel pit was filled up. And these sort of contradictions of arguments are typical of it, and there is a tremendous pressure on angling. On the other hand, gravel digging produced this beautiful place where all the birds now live, and where normally, without difficulty, we catch a lot of fish. But for some reason or other today, we can catch no fish. And that, of course, is one of the fascinations of angling. If you caught fish every time you went angling, there wouldn't be any point in going angling. I had a friend who fished all his life, and when he was finally in bed in hospital, he's never going to go up again. He spent his whole time doing his angling diaries for his whole lifetime, analysing them. And when I went to see him, he said, "I'm not a bad angler, am I?" I said, "You're a very good angler." He said, "Well, I'll tell you something about a very good angler. He has an average of 1 good day in 4 throughout his lifetime of fishing." And I think that that's about right. And today, for some reason, this lake, which normally produces fish, refuses to produce them. But still, as you can see, it's an extremely beautiful place to be. And it satisfies me, but for a dyed-in-the-wool angler like Dave, then this is a severe experience. This is what anglers call being water-whacked. And to be water-whacked on a water where normally you're good at catching fish is a very severe psychological experience for an angler. So I know how he's suffering. Though I'm not suffering because I'm really too old to care. And anyway, what a beautiful place to be produced. And remember that it's produced just because that our modern civilization's need for concrete is so enormous that they can hardly get enough gravel and have to take it out of the sea as well as from places like this in order to keep up with the concrete that's needed every day in the construction industry. And that just about caps it. After all that, the skilled angler has accidentally caught a crayfish. But as I say, it is extraordinary what it does to anglers, particularly good ones like this. I often heard anglers talking about crisis of confidence. This is the sort of thing you normally associate with top golfers or top snooker players. You've seen these snooker players shivering with intensity as they try to play a competition, and you realize they have to go away and rest up and practice till they get their concentration back. And golfers the same. And it is, curious enough, very much the same with the top match anglers. And I knew that something had to be done about him, or he's going to be suffered for days. So I thought the only thing to do was to challenge him to a very difficult angling task. So I said, there's a water near me, which I know and you don't know, and it's got some of the best dace in the country in it. A dace is a very little fish, but a very fine sporting fish. And if it grows to anything near a pound weight, it's a giant. Nevertheless, it's an exciting fish to fish for. But here, on this river, the floods come up very quickly and they're just beginning to rise now. And because they're rising, the water currents are changing. And every quarter of an hour of this rise, the current will be running a different place. And halfway through the rise of the flood, the current will change from one side of an island to another. And the consequence is the fish will shift. They'll shift because their food is shifting. They'll shift because the strong currents, they don't like to fight against the shifting. And you have to be a very good angler if you've never seen a water like this before, and you've just got to watch how it's behaving if you do it. This is why I think I've got a chance against him today, you see, because I know this water a bit better than I do, and I feel sure that I can find the dace before he does. He's missed over on the right there, tried him onto other places. I'm sure I'll get them in that ripple just down below there, but I don't seem to be able to do so. Come on. Heck, I think he's got it right. Actually, if I was in that swim, I think that's exactly where I would assume they would be, where the current has gone round both sides of the island and left a little eddy. You see it turning, left a little eddy at the tail of the island like that. Damn it, he's done it. And it is an absolutely magnificent dace. There you are, you see. Any anglers watching that will know that normally you catch these fish, they're about the size of sardines. But the dace here are something considerable, and I haven't found them. And there's an even better one. I don't suppose many people have got a better dace than that in a month of the season. And I haven't caught one at all. Well, you can see that angling takes you into beautiful places, but you can see that it's not just a contemplative man's recreation that Isaac Walton says it is. It can be a very, very tense business indeed, and I count it a Christian act that I provided exactly the right treatment for the trouble that man was in by giving him a difficult task and allowing him to solve it. So that is one of the intricate pleasures of angling, which has changed so much and been under so much stress over the years of my lifetime. Cheerio.